Welcome to CNN Money Switzerland. On the 1st of July, you'll have been in your role at the SNB for 3 years. How do you see your achievements over that time?
I'm a central banker. I'm a member of the governing board. My success is not measured at the individual level. I have a mandate. It's a very clear mandate. My mandate with my colleagues at the board is to fulfill price stability for Switzerland.
And you're achieving that?
It's been, we're in extraordinary times, and we're using unconventional measures, and absolutely, we're back in positive territory, with inflation in positive territory. We're very happy about it. Inflation remains low. Absolutely, we believe we're fulfilling our mandate.
All right, we'll get into the technicalities a little bit later, but this isn't your first time at the Swiss National Bank, is it?
No, I started my very first job after my PhD was at the National Bank as an economist, absolutely.
And have things changed in that time? Do you remember?
Oh, absolutely, I remember. I think it was also a very nice start for me. That's when I started to get into the relationship between banks and monetary policy and financial stability. I ended up leaving. Mm-hmm. And that is a theme I continued throughout, and now I'm back.
And that's your passion. You seem very passionate as soon as we started talking about it.
Absolutely, it is my passion.
In between your two kind of stints at the SNB, you were also at the IMF. You were also at the UN Conference for Trade and Development. Are the cultures within these big organisations and institutions similar, would you say?
That's a good question. There's some similarities. I think the main one, I would say, they all face tremendous and global challenges. So in all of these institutions I've worked in, there's been really important to be agile and to react to external factors. The big difference at the SNB, we conduct monetary policy. We make decisions, and these decisions have an immediate impact on Switzerland.
Is that very fulfilling for you?
It's a big responsibility. And for this responsibility, I'm very privileged to work with the team that I work at the governing board. We're a strong team. This, together with the fact that we can rely on highly qualified, highly committed team of staff, gives me the confidence that we can address the challenges that we face.
Now, your department at the SNB specifically looks after the Swiss franc exchange rate. How do you see current developments within Europe? So
the Swiss franc has depreciated over the last year. That's good news for us, for Switzerland. It remains highly valued. And more importantly, the last few months have really shown that the conditions are fragile, and particularly regarding uncertainties in Europe.
And presumably you're talking about what's happening in Italy.
That's one of the uncertainties that we're facing, but it's not the only one. There is Italy. I mean, there's geopolitical tension. We also see when there's uncertainties about potential conflict of trade, all of these increase uncertainties, and they can have an impact on the Swiss franc. But you're absolutely right. In the last year or so, the main impact has been on the franc. Other currencies have reacted more strongly to, say, trade conflict in Asia, for instance.
How do these events affect your affect your investment policy?
So, as you know, we have had a big build-up in foreign exchange reserves. That is directly a result of our monetary policy. We've had to intervene sometimes on the foreign exchange markets, and these interventions have meant we've bought foreign exchange reserves. Those we have to manage. It's a direct result of our monetary policy. Now our investment policy has to continue to serve our monetary policy.
And where are the challenges then?
Well, what does it mean? A key challenge and a key difference for us, because we have to be subordinated to monetary policy, our investment policy has to be the priority is our monetary policy. We cannot hedge against our biggest risk, which is FX risk. We cannot, because to hedge our positions, we would have to buy Swiss franc, which would go directly against our monetary policy. In practice, that means we need a very broad diversification, and we have that across instruments. We have 20% of our balance sheet is now invested in equity. We have it across currencies, across regions in the world, across duration. That's a very important part for us.
How does your investment policy then differ, say, from that in the UK or the Fed?
Well, we have a very different we have a very large balance sheet, and our balance sheet is entirely made up of FX reserves, which is not the case, say, by the ECB or the Fed. They bought a lot of paper, but domestic paper. We, because we intervene on the FX market, we have FX reserves. So that makes it very different, both in the objective and how we manage it.
How do you manage expectation?
So expectation is a very important factor for any central bank. Communication is the most important part. Is communication. Ultimately, what we have to achieve is trust. Trust is we have to take decisions, sometimes difficult one. The most important is to always be able to explain them clearly. I must say, during the last few years and since the beginning of the global financial crisis, the SNB has really intensified its communication.
I was about to ask about that because for me, it seems that the SNB is a lot more accessible than other central banks. The Fed rarely would sit down and do a one-to-one interview, for example, and we never hear from Mario Draghi. But that is a conscious decision on your part to be more communicative.
Absolutely. It's good to hear that this is also how it is perceived. We believe very strongly how important it is to be independent. We have to make tough decisions at times. For that, we need to be independent. But that independence can only work if we are accountable. And to be accountable, you have to be able to explain what you do and why you do it.
You say that you're independent, but we very much talk about how everything that comes from the SNB, we have to wait for other central banks to make their decisions first. Is that independent?
It is independent. We definitely conduct monetary policy in the interest of the Swiss economy, and we try to influence our own monetary condition.
But we are very tied.
But we are a small, open economy. We're fairly small, and we're definitely very open. So, for instance, our monetary condition depends on two major factors, the exchange rate and the interest rate, and particularly the interest rate differential. So that means what happens abroad, what the Fed does, what the ECB does, what happens in the rest of the world is necessarily going to change our room for maneuver. Within that room for maneuver, we conduct an autonomous monetary policy.
So we're as independent as we can be within the circumstances.
We live in one world. Absolutely.
Now, the SNB's recent monetary policy meeting, nothing new on rates, but there were a couple of interesting things that came out of your meeting. The fact that the big banks here in Switzerland must do more to protect themselves against any further crises. I mean, where did that come from?
It's a little bit the story of a glass half full or half empty. I think the way we look at it is that the big banks have been doing what they've been asked to be doing. They've increased their capital, they're more liquid, they've started to really work on the resolution plans, which are also internationally very important. Now, the regulation, there's been a plan, there's been requirements, they've been set over a number of years. What we're saying is that it's very important not to stop now, but to use the favorable environment to continue, and to continue in the same direction that what they've done so far.
I'm just wondering, though, do you see trouble brewing ahead, or are you just being very Swiss about this and doubling down on precaution?
We're not doubling down on precaution. I think there's been a plan that's been set. It's been, the too big to fail regulation. The first time it started to be introduced in 2012. There's been revised until, in the end, I think it's important to recognize what the objective is. The objective is to make sure that in the case of financial distress of an institution in Switzerland, there is no need to necessarily bail it out with public fund. And until that that condition has been satisfied, it's important to continue the full implementation the way it has been foreseen in the law.
Also, the housing market is causing you some concern. Could you explain that a little more?
Absolutely. So the housing market, we have one of the highest mortgage credit to GDP ratio in the world, although it has remained stable. Prices in the real estate have been increasing over the last couple of years, or actually 10 years, but we have a particular concern in one segment, and that's the residential investment properties segment. That's rent-to-lease apartment buildings. That's where we see the highest risk relative to the other segments of a price correction.
Is this a bubble that you're talking about in this sector?
We just see a number of factors. What we're trying to do is raise awareness so that banks and borrowers are very careful, and that only those who can carry the risk they're taking are really taking the risk.
And so this is a warning not just for the banks, but for...
Absolutely, because it's a demand and supply issue, right? It's the ones who provide the credit, and it's the one who take it on. Because we're seeing a couple developments. One, we see vacancy rates that are starting to rise. At the same time, we see what we call affordability risks starting to rise. So people take higher mortgages or higher rents relative to what they earn. And we also have seen a very sharp increase in prices over the last year. So all of these factors provide, it's a buildup of risk we're trying to be aware of.
And could this risk spread to other sectors in the residential property area?
You know, ultimately, that's a big question. What is important is to have a banking sector that is resilient to shocks. And we see there a particular risk. Mm-hmm. Now, we just came out with our last financial stability report, in which we also show a number of results from stress tests under very adverse scenarios. Currently, we see that the financial system, and particularly the domestic-oriented banks that are particularly exposed in that sector, are resilient. But given the imbalances and the buildup of risk that we see, we think it's very important that that level of capital is maintained.
So this is a very early warning.
Well, it's awareness of risk to make sure that people know what they're doing. Because once you take this kind of risk on your balance sheet, it takes a lot of years to really build it down. So it's easy to build up a risk, a balance sheet risk. It's much harder to reduce it. This is why, for us, it's very important to have those kind of warnings.
Let's talk about the Swiss financial system as a whole then. I mean, how is it doing right now?
The financial economy?
Yes.
Switzerland is doing quite well. Growth has been robust, and also for next year, we expect growth to be around 2% for 2018, with a further decline in unemployment. This is very good. Of course, there are some sectors which are still having some difficulty, like the tourism economy is suffering from the highly valued franc, or there are some structural changes like the retail sector with digitalization, online markets. But overall, absolutely, we are seeing the Swiss economy has a very strong dynamic.
And how long do you see this growth continuing?
The point is, we announced that for us, it was very important to keep our expansionary monetary policy. So that means that we are seeing still some fragility. And the main one that we see is inflation remains very low. In fact, we've had to revise downward our medium-term conditional inflation forecast. So we see that the dynamics, although it is strong, it is taking a while until it's really reflected in higher prices.
And what about the way the Swiss financial system is run? Are you happy with the way things are? I'm obviously referring to the sovereign currency vote that happened and did not pass. But surely the concerns of that movement are still around?
I think first of all, we are very happy about the vote. It would have been a radical change of the way our monetary system works and a radical change for the financial system. And no, we do not think that those changes were warranted. I think one of the strengths of the Swiss financial system has been its ability to adjust when there's been a need to adjust. And I think it's important to keep that flexibility. But we have a much more resilient financial sector than it was 10 years ago.
But the issue of protecting ourselves against another financial crisis hasn't got away. Do you see the idea of a sovereign currency developing further or coming back in some new form?
It'll be interesting to see. I think what is always important with this kind of initiative is to be very clear what you're trying to achieve and whether what you're proposing is the best way to achieve that objective. In that particular case, one of the key objectives was to make bank deposits safer. Now in Switzerland, we have very safe deposits, the bank deposits. So again, I think it's a question, and there's going to be new demands. But if there is something that the Swiss population wants to change, I think it's important to identify it clearly and to make sure we tackle, or Switzerland tackles it with the right instruments.
Aside from sovereign currency, what are the other challenges facing us here in Switzerland? I'm thinking of the obvious cryptocurrency, of course.
So cryptocurrency is a big buzzword. It's interesting because Switzerland, when you referred to something what we call private cryptocurrency or private money, and private money, in fact, is something we know in Switzerland. In Switzerland, there is a number of private money, le Léman, and some of them are in the French. It's not exactly the same, but it's the same nature in the sense that private cryptocurrency that are not backed up by a robust institutional framework are not likely to be a real competition for a fiat currency like the Swiss franc.
I mean, you say it is a buzzword, it's a bit of a trend at the moment, but aside from that, I mean, even the government are thinking about an e-franc. I mean, so, you know, it's being taken seriously at high levels.
No, absolutely. I think it's important to differentiate. So the private cryptocurrencies are not likely to compete with fiat currency that is backed by an entire institutional framework. That is one thing. It's a speculative investment with high price volatility. Then there is the technology behind it. Blockchain, right? DLT, distributed ledger technology. And I think that technology has quite a bit of potential. And this is something we certainly are following very closely, particularly for us in the area of what it could mean for the financial market infrastructure. But the technology still has to prove itself. Can it be more efficient than what we have currently? Is it scalable? Is it more safe? Can it work in the system at the right amount, at the right volume? Those are questions that still need to be tested, that need to be monitored. And yes, these are issues that we are monitoring very closely.
Switzerland is really putting itself out there when it comes to blockchain and cryptocurrency. Do you think we were a little too early to set ourselves up in that position then?
I think Switzerland has always been innovative, and I think it's a very important feature of Switzerland. I'm a member of the governing board of the Swiss National Bank, so it's not up to me to make industrial policy or sectoral policy. I think what is important for us is absolutely to always understand how you can use this technology for Switzerland to remain competitive. And in our case, what is so important is to have a really efficient payment system.
Let's change gears slightly now. How is the Swiss relationship with China? I'm thinking about the ICBC has just recently opened a bank here, and we've got the new RMB hub. It's also opened, which allows companies to kind of access Chinese currency. I mean, is there a want to foster that relationship?
I think China is an increasingly important player. We see it on several grounds, as you mentioned it. We supported the renminbi hub in Switzerland. I think it's part of making sure we have a global financial system that continues to support the economy. for the SNB, it's important to be able to conduct monetary policy under any condition. One thing that we're seeing, we mentioned earlier, is our investment policy. And we have a small investment also in China, only government bonds and only those that are actually traded in Hong Kong, but it is something we follow very closely. We have a team in Singapore that helps us to make sure that we fully understand the developments that are taking place in the Asia-Pacific region.
And they're important developments.
They're absolutely important developments.
Now, it's very easy to talk about you being the first female governing board member of the SNB, but is gender relevant at all to your job?
Look, Switzerland right now, like most of the other central banks, under tremendous challenges. And from that perspective, no. Gender in itself is not an issue. What is important is the voice that you bring to the table, to the discussions. The SNB is a highly professional institution. What we need is expertise. What we do need is diversity, in the sense when we make our decisions, it's not a decision in a small board, it's a decision that we need from all of our experts. We need our 900 staff members to help us make the right decision. That requires diversity, not only gender, the whole range of diversity. And that's something
when the glass ceiling still exists, it is important to see women in finance and to ensure women have equal opportunities to those jobs in finance.
Absolutely. So from that perspective, it's not relevant in terms of us making a better decision, but it is relevant in terms of, for me, it is an honor to be the first woman on the governing board of the Swiss National Bank. I think it's a very good example. It opens up doors. Hopefully, it makes many women and also I'm not only a woman, I'm from the Suisse romande. So if it can make it more interesting for others to come, I think that is a very important role.
And what about more generally women in finance as well? Because we've obviously seen Janet Yellen, for example. We've got Christine Lagarde.
There are many women in high-level positions. You're absolutely right. Finance is still one of those bastions where there are few women. I see it in my teams, but I think that is changing. And it's important to be aware of the asset that a fully diversified team brings.
Mm. You mentioned that you're obviously from Swiss romande. I understand that your mother was from the French-speaking part, but your father from the German-speaking part of Switzerland.
Has the other way around.
Oh, is it the other way around?
The other way around.
My apologies, but does that background give you a kind of better understanding of the Swiss psyche, do you think? I think it does. I think what gave me a better understanding of the psychic is the chance I've had when I was young to be an athlete and to compete for the Swiss. I was a swimmer. Yes.
And to compete for the Swiss team, and that gave me always. So we were always in a team, and when we were young, no one spoke all these languages, or we always had one who could translate. So that kind of diversity within Switzerland is something I absolutely grew up with.
In fact, I wrote down that your best time was 2 minutes 23 for the 200-metre medley. Is that right? For the Swiss national swimming team.
Very good homework you did.
Do you still swim?
No, very little. No.
What kind of activities do you like to do outside of work? Because work must be very consuming.
It is. Sport continues to be an important thing, but I have children, so now my sport is usually with my children. We have a lot of activity, and it's fun.
All right, we'll leave it there. Andréa Maechler, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.